I'm really delighted to introduce this session on new narratologies. We begin with Professor Harald Hoebusch, Professor of German Studies and Associate Chair in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures and Cultures at the University of Kentucky. He's the editor of Colloquia Germanica, and he's interested in 20th century German cultural studies with a focus on sports history, mountaineering in particular. He's interested also in foreign language pedagogy and has many publications on his record. 2 monographs, Mountain of Destiny, Nanga, Parbat and its Path into the German Imagination, published in 2016 with Camden House, and a book entitled Thomas Mann, Kunst, Kritik, Politik, 1893-1913, just to be on the quick side. My German is really, really rusty, published with Franke in 2000. But he's also published several articles on Nature Amplified, the skywalk phenomenon in the European Alps, which is forthcoming right now in the Journal of Tourism and Leisure Studies, In the Face of Tragedy, Nanga, Parbat and the Nationalist Socialist Radio, in the Intern, Journal of the History of Sports in 2020, and then translation of chapter 13 of Hans Hertel, Meine wilden 30er Jahre, with introduction and notes in Shore Ayrton and Caroline Schaumann, Mountains and the German Mind. You also did a commentary, is that correct, for the BBC
correct,
channel Time Shift production entitled Battle for the Himalayas, the Flight to Film Everest. Alexander Luckman, our second speaker, is a PhD student in the history of art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, specializing in histories of architecture, preservation, and landscape. His primary research focus is modern and contemporary religious architecture, and particularly the continued importance of religious buildings in the supposedly secularizing societies of the United States and Germany. His additional interests include historic preservation and the environment, and he has published quite extensively. His writing has appeared in Slate, the Architect's Newspaper, the Cleveland Review of Books, React Review, which is a responsive journal for art and architecture. And last but not least, our third panelist is Raphaela Pavlokos. Is that correct? Okay. Who is a third-year PhD student at McMaster University in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. So she's in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Her research focuses on reading landscape alongside Indigenous literatures of Southern Ontario, especially looking at the work of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe writers. She's also developing a methodological framework for ethical reading practices settlers can use to engage with Indigenous texts called critical dispositioning, and is always seeking new ways of using her scholarly and poetic work. She works as a teaching assistant within her department, as well as a traditional Greek dance instructor in her community. So we have 3 very well-rounded and interdisciplinary speakers. And I'm going to ask Harald, everybody to mute themselves, and Harald to take it away.
Thank you very much, Simona, for a very kind introduction, and welcome to my co-panelists, of course, and everybody else who has joined us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My paper is titled The Ghost of Nanga Parbat, Revisiting Donald Shebib's Das Weiße Tor zur Hölle, The White Gate to Hell. On 19 October 2023, the Tegernsee International Mountain Film Festival screened excerpts from Hans Ertel's award-winning film Nanga Parbat 1953, celebrating the 17th anniversary of the first ascent of Nanga Parbat by Austrian climber Hermann Buhl on 3 July 1953 as a member of Dr. Karl Maria Hellikoffer's German-Austrian Willy Merkel Memorial Expedition, thereby keeping alive for yet another generation of mountain enthusiasts and mountain film aficionados the memory of one of the greatest mountaineering achievements in the 20th century. Memory has faded in Germany, however, as regards another film that dramatized Buhl's ascent, a successful solo ascent, Canadian director Donald Shebib's Nanga Parbat, The White Gate to Hell, originally released in Germany in 1987 and re-released in 2017 as Nanga Parbat, based on a true story. While Ertl's Nanga Parbat 1953 has already received some scholarly attention, nothing to date has been written about Shebib's production, a production virtually unknown to today's mountain film audiences in Germany and English language film scholars due to its very limited release and success in Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. In my presentation today, I endeavored to close this particular gap in our still expanding knowledge about the filmic and other media representations of German Nanga Parbat expeditions by not only investigating how Shebib retells the story of one of the most famous ascents in the history of Himalayan mountaineering, but also by asking how Shebib's version relates to previous accounts in both film and print of Buhl's unprecedented climb. Shebib's feature, as I will demonstrate, sets out to present an unbiased look back at the events of the 1953 Nanga Parbat expedition and the driving forces behind the actions of two of its key members. However, it ultimately falls short of this goal due to its director's inability to avoid carrying over the ideological baggage of previous National Socialist accounts of German Nanga Parbat expeditions into his own film. By relying almost exclusively on Buhl's book 8,000 Above and Below, a text partly written and ultimately arranged by Alpine ghostwriter Kurt Meix, an ardent proponent of the German nationalistic view of mountaineering of the 1930s, Shebib unknowingly and fatefully upsets the originally intended balance of perspectives in his feature. As regards the origin of The White Gate to Hell, Shebib had been approached by Canadian television CTV with a request to contribute to a project called Mountain Men, a 3-part TV series co-produced with the BBC that would retell the stories of some of the greatest climbs in mountaineering history. As his source for the film's screenplay, as already mentioned, Shebib relied almost exclusively on Buhl's 1954 book 8,000 Above and Below. Shebib, however, added something uniquely his own: frequent fictional monologues by Hermann Buhl directed at his wife Eugenie. He did so, as he explained during a phone interview conducted in March 2017, and I quote, "Because I knew that by using this kind of material and getting deeper into the mystique of climbing and Buhl's own personal view of climbing, I could use that which would interweave with the ongoing story of the conflict between Buhl and Dr. Hellikoffer," end quote. What then does the interweaving of these two stories in Shebib's film look like? Does Shebib indeed avoid, as he claimed during my conversation with him, a good guy, bad guy thing in his portrayal of the Buhl-Hellikoffer relationship? And would Shebib's account of the German-Austrian Willy Merkel Memorial Expedition finally be free of the ideological baggage that had still burdened Hans Ertl's Nanga Parbat 1953 film more than 30 years earlier, a film that, as I've demonstrated elsewhere, not only documents the successful ascent of one of the world's highest mountains in 1953, but also unintentionally reveals, via its internal contradictions, the central identity problem of West Germany during the 1950s so-called economic miracle. Despite focusing on the present, it simply cannot escape the past, or, to put it more radically, revealing its most troubling legacy and Ertl's ultimate blind spot, it sees nothing wrong with perpetuating fascist ideas into a democratic future. In The White Gate to Hell, Shebib develops the positions of his two protagonists with the help of a triple dialogic structure: frequent intercutting between the main camp and the ascent, presenting the respective mountaineering philosophies of Hellikoffer and Buhl in separate scenes, and having Hellikoffer and Buhl confront each other in the same scene, thereby providing the viewer with insights into each man's compulsion for climbing mountains. The motivation of the expedition leader is presented via a scene in the main camp where Herlikofer addresses his climbers and explains the meaning of the expedition. Referring to Nanga Parbat as the mountain of destiny and recalling the death of his half-brother Willy Merkel in 1934, he declares, and I quote, "I swore he would never be forgotten. I've organized this expedition to conquer this most murderous of mountains in his name. This is why we're here, to succeed where all before us have failed, to climb to the top of Nanga Parbat," end quote. Boole's reaction to Herlikofer's explanation is a look of suspicion, a suspicion deepened in a subsequent scene depicting climbers during their ascent. In a voiceover, Boole criticizes Herlikofer's mountaineering philosophy, and I quote, "He's constantly telling us about the virtues of teamwork and organization and that we are here for the glory of Germany and our lost comrades. He seems to run things like we were still in the army," end quote. Herlikofer's and Boole's conflict reaches a preliminary climax in the form of a confrontation in the main camp when Boole stresses the need for individual risk-taking on the mountain, and Herlikofer reminds him of the group effort, and I quote, "But may I remind you, you are now a member of a team, and you will do what you are told," end quote. Back on the ascent, Boole recalls his confrontation for Eugenie, questions Herlikofer's obsession with his half-brother, and eventually explains his own reason for trying to reach the summit of Nanga Parbat. He's simply climbing for himself. It is exactly this motivation that Herlikofer criticizes in Boole when, following a dispute during a radio call about the current placement of Camp 3, he calls Boole, and I quote, "too obstinate, too obsessed," end quote. What drives both men to their respective ways of approaching the mountain is finally revealed about halfway into the film in two long scenes, one focusing on Boole, the other one on Herlikofer. Boole, once again addressing Eugenie in his diary, sees mountaineering as a way of finding peace within himself, as a way of being in unison with the mountain, with nature, with God. Ultimately, for Boole, one doesn't conquer the mountain, but only oneself. Herlikofer's fascination, if not obsession, with his half-brother Willy Merkel is explained during a heated exchange between the expedition leader and Boole in the main camp. In this scene, Herlikofer shares the story of a night spent as a child alone on a mountaintop, left there by his father to rid him of his quote-unquote unmanly phobia. Immobilized by fear, he was rescued by Willy, who climbed the mountain during that night, brought him something to eat, and safely descended with him the next morning. This two-scene sequence ends with each man reinforcing his own way of seeing matters. Herlikofer tells Boole that he will never achieve the greatness of his half-brother Willy Merkel, and Boole once more stresses his individualism. I quote, "Those who have gone before me are of no concern of mine. I will climb this mountain not for Dr. Herlikofer or for Willy Merkel, but for myself," end quote. Shebib's film ends in a final confrontation between Herlikofer and Boole after Boole's successful return from the summit and his arrival in the main camp. Here, the confrontation is of an intensely visual nature, achieved through frequent intercutting, first between Herlikofer and Peter Aschenbrenner, an expedition member, on the one hand, and Hermann Boole on the other, then between Herlikofer and Boole themselves. Few words are spoken. A stone-faced Herlikofer utters, and I quote, "You did it by yourself," end quote, voicing one last time his criticism of Boole's mountaineering philosophy, to which Boole responds by saying, "No, doctor, not by myself." What Boole refers to in these cryptic last words is one of the most intriguing scenes in Shebib's film. It is a scene of great length and intensity and depicts Boole on the painful descent after his successful summit push. Boole hears a voice and sees the apparition of another climber, causing him to inquire about his identity. The climber simply responds, and I quote, "A friend, a fellow climber like yourself," end quote. The mysterious climber repeatedly encourages Boole to continue his descent, especially at times Boole is about to give up. When Boole asks him again who he is, the climber responds with a question, and I quote, "Don't you recognize me?" end quote. Boole suddenly realizes that he's talking to Willy Merkel. Repeatedly depicted as descending together, Merkel reminds Boole that he has to bring his fellow mountaineers, his comrades, the news, and I quote, "of all of us, those who came before and those who are waiting below. All who helped to build a pyramid whose last stone was given to you to put in place. Your reaching the summit has justified all our sacrifices. You alone stood on the top. but all of us were with you, end quote. Buhl agrees to deliver this news, and only when he finally approaches the high camp he left 41 hours ago does Merkel's apparition disappear. What then do we make of Shebib's film in regard to this portrayal of the relationship between Herrlichkoffer and Buhl? I would argue that Shebib indeed tried to stay true to his original intent to avoid, quote, a good guy, bad guy thing, end quote, and produce a film that would not shy away from depicting the animosity between Herrlichkoffer and Buhl and the clash between their respective mountaineering philosophies. At the same time, however, he was clearly interested in moving beyond the surface of this conflict between an expedition leader and his best climber and identify some of the driving forces behind their admittedly sometimes inflexible attitudes. But what about the scene between Buhl and the apparition of Willy Merkel? Does it not contradict Buhl's statement earlier in the film that he does not intend to climb Nanga Parbat for Herrlichkoffer or Willy Merkel, but only for himself? And does Buhl in the scene not subscribe to Herrlichkoffer's mountaineering philosophy, a philosophy he had until then so vehemently rejected, to climb in the name of those who came before, to complete the project where others had failed, in short, to fulfill a legacy? In order to answer these questions, we must now turn to Shebib's primary source for his screenplay, Hermann Buhl's book, 8,000 Meters Above and Below. As a detailed comparison between Shebib's screenplay and Buhl's text reveals, the director, with the exception of Buhl's fictional monologues directed at Eugenie and Herrlichkoffer's equally fictional account of a night spent as a child alone on the mountain, stayed very close to Buhl's version of events as reported in 8,000 Meters Above and Below. But this reliance, as will soon become apparent, causes a problem as it offsets Shebib's carefully calibrated balance between the views of Herrlichkoffer and Buhl. All of a sudden, Herrlichkoffer's way of seeing things seems to gain the upper hand. His motivation of fulfilling the legacy of his half-brother Willy Merkel seems to be adopted by Buhl. What then explains the sudden imbalance? As it turns out, Buhl's portrayal of the events on Nanga Parbat in 1953 carries its own ideological baggage. It was written as a counter-narrative to Herrlichkoffer's official expedition report titled Nanga Parbat 1953, a report in which the expedition leader's boundless adoration for his half-brother's mountaineering achievements, first and foremost his two Nanga Parbat expeditions, as expressed originally in Herrlichkoffer's 1936 book, Willy Merkel, A Journey to Nanga Parbat, continue to manifest itself. As Herrlichkoffer explains in the first chapter of his report, 2 years after Willy's death, he had memorialized him in his earlier book, and upon learning of the tragic outcome of the 1937 expedition and finally comprehending the tragic nature of the 1934 events, he had committed himself to fulfilling, and I quote, the legacy of all those who died on Nanga Parbat, end quote. The legacy of Willy Merkel and those who lost their lives in 1937 also dominate Herrlichkoffer's overview of pre-World War II German expeditions in Chapter 2. It is Merkel's mountaineering philosophy which guides Herrlichkoffer's discussion of the mental attitude required for Himalaya mountaineering. Most importantly, the one notion that had dominated Merkel's mountaineering philosophy, the notion of comradeship, would inform how Herrlichkoffer conducted his own enterprise. Buhl's counter-narrative in 8,000 Meters Above and Below, spanning a mere 44 out of 286 pages due to legal restrictions imposed by Herrlichkoffer, consists of 3 parts: a brief non-linear introduction, a chronological account of the expedition from early June to early July, concluding with Buhl's return to the main camp, and a short retrospective titled 1 Year Later. The introduction to Buhl's expedition account is characterized what is best described as a series of impressionistic vignettes, of flashes of memory that recall the most dramatic moments of the expedition. The overwhelming sight of Nanga Parbat from the air, the safety and comfort of the main camp, the gigantic north face, the sublime panorama of the surrounding mountain ranges, the wild chaos of the Rakiot Glacier, and above all, the terrifying avalanches encountered by the mountaineers. In almost rhapsodic style, these vignettes repeatedly present Nanga Parbat as a living entity that repulses the efforts of man to scale its heights, as a giant that has, quote unquote, devoured already 31 humans, end quote. Most importantly, they identified the 1953 expedition as belonging to a series of previous efforts to scale Nanga Parbat and introduce once more the notion of legacy when they have Boole ask, and I quote, "Would we be able to follow in the footsteps of those who had been before us, who had struggled, attacked, defended themselves just to be defeated in the end? Would we be able to complete that which had eluded all others?" End quote. In his subsequent chronology of the expedition, Boole continues to rely heavily on impressionistic narrative elements. Through his intimate descriptions of his physical as well as psychological state, especially during his long journey to and from the summit of Nanga Parbat, he allows his readers to participate in the joy and agony of his success. Furthermore, in order to describe his progress on the mountain and connect his own efforts to those of an earlier generation of climbers, he repeatedly references Merkel's expedition of 1932 and especially 1934. Merkel's generation, he claims, has left him with a legacy, and I quote, "Yes, the great mountain is the goal. We must try to grow with its challenges. We do not approach it frivolously, provokingly, rather with deliberate courage, a tenacious will, and a passionate heart. The men who had been driven by the same spirit and were cut down by the mountain live on in our memory. They walk along with us, not as messengers of death, but as guides to life, to the summit," end quote. Boole's narrative strategies in 8,000 meters above and below, therefore, are surprisingly similar to those used by Herrlichkofer in his official expedition report. At the same time, Boole leaves no doubt that he disagrees with Herrlichkofer's overall assessment of the 1953 expedition. In his own record, he repeatedly criticizes various aspects of Herrlichkofer's leadership. This observation, however, presents us with a fundamental question. How could such a discrepancy come about in the first place? Did Hermann Boole simply overlook the glaring contradiction between what he said and how he said it? The answer lies in the surprising genesis of Boole's book. As it turns out, Boole was not the sole author of 8,000 meters above and below. While Boole wrote the original manuscript, his text was subsequently revised by the Viennese mountaineer and alpine rider Kurt Meiks. Kurt Meiks, however, was an, quote, outspoken supporter of National Socialism in Austria, end quote, and author of the influential 1935 book, Man on the Mountain. In this programmatic text, Meiks had linked the mountaineer's struggle to the mountain of the national community, the Volk, and propagated a new egalitarian mountaineering, quote-unquote, comradeship. In the case of 8,000 meters above and below, Meiks, as he admitted in a letter to Boole's wife in 1958, had, quote-unquote, improved on Boole's original text, and I quote, "I removed," he says, "everything that might have harmed him. I revised certain passages into their opposite. I sometimes completely rewrote entire chapters based on my own experiences," end quote. Meiks retained Boole's critical comments about Herrlichkofer's leadership of the expedition from his diary. He added, however, two things: the previously discussed impressionistic elements in the form of frequent remarks about Boole's physical and psychological state, clearly for dramatic reasons, and more importantly, an interpretive framework for Boole's climb that simply has no equivalent in Boole's diary. In Ralph Peter Mertin's words, and I quote him, "Since Boole's text contained no ideology, Meiks filled in this blank space in his best conscience and according to his innermost convictions," end quote. It is the fact that Meiks, very much like Herrlichkofer in his official account of the 1953 German-Austrian Willy Merkel expedition, drew on the narrative conventions and ideological constructs of a bygone era, that ultimately explains why Boole's book, despite its clear criticism of Herrlichkofer's performance as an expedition leader, nevertheless resorts to the same narrative strategies for the presentation of its counter-narrative. To conclude, the position of Donald Shebib's Nanga Parbat, the White Gate to Hell, within the context of previous accounts of German Nanga Parbat expeditions in both film and print, can thus be defined as follows. Very much like Ertl's Nanga Parbat 1953 and Boole's 8,000 meters above and below, Shebib's feature is invaded by the concept and notions of a problematic past. While Ertl's film suffered from a visual and conceptual blind spot due to its director's close association with the filmic language of the German Berg film, the mountain film, and his own repeat association with National Socialist propaganda filmmaking, Boole's text suffered at the hands of an ideologically tainted ghostwriter. Shebib's film, in turn, suffers from its director's almost exclusive reliance on Boule's book as a source for his screenplay, in combination with his unfortunate lack of awareness of the complicated authorship constellation between 8,000 meters above and below. All three individuals are ultimately unable to shed the ideological baggage of an earlier era in their respective accounts of German expeditions to the Mountain of Destiny, Nanga Parbat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. Harald, apologies, I did not read the title of your presentation earlier, which is The Ghost of Nanga Parbat, Revisiting Donald Shebib's Weisse zur Hölle. So I do apologize for that. We move on to our second speaker, who's Alexander Luckman, and who is going to talk about God's office building on Broadway, skyscrapers, and advertising at the Broadway Temple, 1924-1929.
All right, thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you so much to Simona and to all of the other panelists and everyone this morning. So I'm going to be talking about God's office building on Broadway and about skyscraper churches more broadly. In March 1923, the Saturday Evening Post described the problems urban churches were facing. As commercial downtowns expanded, congregants were pushed out to suburban neighborhoods. Most churches sold their downtown real estate and followed their congregation, a symbolic defeat for religion. But, Frank Parker Stockbridge wrote, there was a way out: build the church into a skyscraper. This idea was being put into practice across the United States. Stockbridge defined the skyscraper church as, quote, the combination of the church with an income-producing, more or less commercial building, which it owns and of which it is an integral part, end quote. The skyscraper church was the newest 1920s craze. This presentation investigates the Broadway Temple in Manhattan, one of the most ambitious planned skyscraper churches. I argue that the new architectural typology of the skyscraper church, mostly practiced by Methodist congregations, was valued both for earning rental income and for returning religion to a central place on the city skyline. Moreover, I argue that the desire to have church crosses visible on the skyline cast architecture as the ultimate act of church advertising, a booming area of interest in the 1920s, as the new advertising profession sought to legitimate itself and as religious leaders felt that they had to compete in a new marketplace of attention. Although some skyscraper churches were conceived in the early years of the century, the boom in this typology occurred between the end of World War I and the stock market crash. It's a pretty narrow, tightly bracketed decade. The tallest built skyscraper church was the Chicago Temple, which was Chicago's tallest building from 1924 until 1930. This structure attracted national and international interest, as the slew of letters in the temple archives attests to. One of the letters came from a young minister named Christian F. Reesner, pastor of Chelsea Methodist Episcopal Church in New York City. In late 1923, Reesner wrote that his church was, quote, rapidly shaping up our plans to finance a $4 million church building to be combined with dormitories and apartment houses. It is not surprising that it was Reesner who formulated such an ambitious plan. He began his career as a reporter and editor in his hometown of Atchison, Kansas. After turning to preaching, he gained a reputation for growing congregations in increasingly larger churches in Kansas City, then Denver, and eventually New York. Rolf Lundén has written that, quote, no clergyman in America was more high-powered than Christian F. Reesner, end quote. Reesner became pastor at Chelsea Methodist Episcopal in 1920, and he began to work toward a skyscraper church after the construction of the George Washington Bridge forced the church to move. Originally planned for 24 stories, but later raised to 34, the Broadway Temple would have been located on Broadway between 173rd and 174th Streets. One article noted that, quote, it is Dr. Reesner's idea that only by physical dominance can adequate architectural expression be given to the idea of spiritual dominance, end quote. The scheme called for 2 lower apartment blocks flanking a central tower. The tower would have included a worship space seating between 2,200 and 2,500 people, a gymnasium, swimming pool, game rooms, club rooms, restaurant, and roof playgrounds, and other religious spaces at ground level. Above these would be an apartment hotel, and a revolving cross illuminated at night would top the tower. The architect was Don Barber, who reflected on the development of the skyscraper church. Whereas, quote, it used to be that from the river you saw a forest of spires over New York, churches have been submerged in two ways. First, physically, they disappeared, went under, got lost behind high buildings. And the churches were likewise buried in the jump of real estate values, end quote. Barber here echoed Henry James's 1907 lament of, quote, the spire of Trinity Church, so cruelly overtopped and so barely distinguishable, in its abject, helpless humility, end quote. The price for the Broadway temple was initially set at $4,400,000. Reasoner embarked on what Anke Kut describes as, quote, two levels of publicity. On the one hand, symbolically loading meaning onto the building, while on the other hand, turning the individual steps of the building process and financing into a sort of entertaining serial in the daily press, end quote. Reasoner hired Louis Victor Eiting, who was paroled from a murder sentence in the Arizona penitentiary on account of his skill at writing advertisements, and I'm not making this up, to help sell the scheme. Eiting mailed 8,000 copies of a marketing brochure to potential investors. Titled An Open Letter That Promises Happiness, the pamphlet asked, quote, have you ever heard of anyone loaning money to God? Yes, and having an actual 5% interest paid, the loan being secured by mortgage? No one is begging you for a gift. We are trying to interest you in an investment, a loan to God first, secured by income-earning property. But better still, an investment that will give vital happiness to your neighbors and more to yourself, end quote. Eiting and Reasoner framed helping pay for the Broadway temple not as an act of Christian charity, but as an investment opportunity. Another prospectus described the Broadway temple as big business practically applied to religion and boasted that it would, quote, let God have an office building on Broadway, end quote. To an extent, they were successful. Reasoner raised over $3 million from investors, including John D. Rockefeller Jr. Reasoner hired draftsman Hugh Ferris to render the building. The New York Times breathlessly described the Broadway temple, quote, before long, there will shine forth from the skyscraper tower of a church in Upper Broadway a cross that can be seen by 8 million people, but it will rise as high as the tallest towers of downtown Manhattan, end quote. In later plans, this cross was supplemented by a searchlight that would be visible 150 miles at sea. The Broadway temple thus aimed to return religion to a significant place on the skyline. Reasoner's career coincided with the professionalization of American advertising. 19th century salesmen had a reputation for dubious ethics and exaggeration, often on behalf of patent medicines. Around the turn of the century, though, a new breed of advertising agents developed. Instead of salesmen's face-to-face selling, these agents exploited the commercial possibilities of new media, like cheaply available newspapers, high-circulation magazines, and radio. They published, taught, and founded professional organizations, all to turn advertising from a disreputable trade into a respectable profession that could stand beside medicine and law. In 1908, Theodore Fettinger argued that advertising would lead people, quote, to furnish homes artistically, harmoniously, and intelligently, and through this, refine them. And that is, refine the people, not the homes, although through the medium of the home. The advertising industry aimed to avoid federal regulation through the 1910s self-regulating Truth in Advertising campaign, but in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was established to regulate the field. Through a combination of these internal and external levers, by the late 19-teens, the advertising industry had been professionalized. In 1920, Joseph French Johnson, dean of the NYU School of Commerce, told the convention of the Associated Advertising Clubs of the World that yours is the profession of enlightenment. It is an agency of civilization. And 6 years later, President Calvin Coolidge told the Association of Advertising Agencies, founded in 1911, that advertising could save humanity. One of the most prominent members of this profession was O.J. Good. Good invented permanent painted billboards and electric signs, and he ran the country's largest outdoor advertising company. He also coined the term the Great White Way for Broadway, which was a term obsolete pretty much as soon as it was coined because of the colorful advertisements that Good and many others put together. To Good, the city itself was an advertising medium. A member of the New York Municipal Art Society's Committee on Advertising, he proposed electric reproductions of artistic masterworks to make billboards, quote, a power for good in the land. And Good saw his profession as a way of promoting good taste, defined by himself and other members of the elite, and thus using new technologies to impose a conservative moral order upon the city. Good was also a close friend of Reasoner's, and they had overlapping interests. In 1913, Reasoner published the book Church Publicity, The Modern Way to Compel Them to Come in which he laid out recommendations for using advertising to grow the reach of the church. Church Publicity began by establishing the importance of church advertising to grow congregation, and then enumerated the types and strategies of advertising. The book demonstrates how deeply intertwined the church's function and its advertising were to Reasoner. He discussed the best formats for newspaper advertisements alongside the Sunday evening service, and this was one of his great sort of causes and innovations. The Sunday evening service was meant to be entertaining. The most popular one was the annual baseball service, which occurred during the World Series and when baseball was discussed as a metaphor for a virtuous life. Reasoner also held flower services during which every member of the congregation was given a free rose, goldenrod, or dahlia, and a July snow service that saw snow piled on a table. And this shows the snow service. When he was in Denver, it was pretty easy to get snow from the mountains. This became much harder when he moved to New York, but he befriended the owner of a cold plant and used, instead of snow on the right on the altar, are shavings from a refrigeration plant. And then on the left, he got the owner of the cold plant to freeze flowers into a block of ice. And he's lecturing, giving a sermon about this. Other services showed movies of a submarine trip alongside a sermon on submarine sin, to which sadly I have not found the transcript. Against possible objections, Reasoner insisted that these services, like advertising, diverted people from sinful entertainments to the uplift of an entertaining church service. Reasoner believed that the church needed to be a center of activity and recreation, whether at Sunday night services or through basketball games and swimming pools. He wrote little explicitly about church architecture, but all of his work on church publicity was essentially about visibility. At his first New York church, Grace Methodist, Reasoner partnered with Good to build an electric sign consisting of the word grace wedged between the merlons of the church's tower. Reasoner described the sign as, quote, the best single piece of advertising the writer, i.e. Reasoner, has ever done. It has put a mirror in front of faces that were turned toward shameful sin. Its usefulness cannot be estimated. End quote. The tower top sign was augmented by an electric sign rising about 2 stories from street level in a similar format to that of many 1920s cinemas that read, "This may be your church." And it's a little hard to read here, but in a horizontal, it reads, "This may be," and then vertically, "your church." And you can see at the very top of the frame that electric sign from the top of the church tower. Reasoner installed additional signs and billboards for Grace Methodist throughout the city, including one that mysteriously read, "Why do pastors' sons go wrong?" I haven't been able to find any explanation for this yet. So the book Church Publicity made Reasoner a leading figure in the new field of church advertising. This booming movement united churches and pastors across the increasing gap between liberal Protestants who believed in the theory of evolution and advocated looser social mores and a semi-critical reading of the Bible, and conservative or fundamentalist Protestants. And obviously these are very sort of broad programmatic categories, and there's a lot more nuance to them. But from across the spectrum of Protestant religion, church advertising was a field of interest. In 1917, the AACW started a church advertising and publicity department, and the American Advertising Association followed suit in 1919, naming Reasoner the president of its new church advertising department. Not only was advertising essential to the success of the modern church, by building a skyscraper church that dominated the skyline, the whole church could become one giant advertisement for religion. O.J. Good made this point explicit in a 1917 address to the AACW. Quote, "The first steeple that was ever raised over the first Christian church that was ever built was an outdoor announcement that underneath that steeple was a house of worship. And I speak with all due reverence when I say that the steeple has become the trademark of the church." End quote. Good followed a common strategy of legitimation in church advertising, reinterpreting religious history in the light of contemporary concerns. Good saw early church steeples as advertisements avant la lettre. For Good, as for Reasoner, a newspaper advertisement, an electric outdoor sign, and a lighted cross brought the same type of visibility and publicity, merely in different media. The cross was a way of reclaiming religious visibility on the city's skyline that, Protestant leaders feared, had been overwhelmed by commercial buildings. Skyscraper churches might no longer be recognizable as churches from their massing position, bell tower, or even steeple, particularly in these hybrid commercial and religious structures. When these signifiers fell away, the cross became an even more important marker of the skyscraper church's religiosity, proclaiming this is a church, and like Grace Methodist's street sign, "This may be your church," to an audience throughout the city. The skyscraper church was thus what Kathleen James Chakraborty has in Germany described as architecture for a mass audience, whose, quote, "architects appropriated techniques from entertainment and from advertising to reach a mass public in buildings often designed overtly to sell goods as well as utopian social ideals," end quote. Extending from department stores to electric signs, this is what advertising historian William Leach calls the aesthetic to serve business needs, that serve to show off goods day and night through all possible means. In order to advertise and sell products, what Leach calls facades of color, glass, and light transformed the experience of the city. Understood in the framework of church advertising, skyscraper churches sold the ideal of Protestant Christianity as a consumer good through the advertising medium of the city. Construction on the Broadway temple began in June 1925, and the foundation and columns were built, as were the 2 blocks of apartments set to flank the central tower. But by late 1926, Reasoner appealed for a further $1.5 million to fund the temple's completion. He was confident, quote, "That money has to be raised and we will raise it. There is not the slightest doubt of it," end quote. Reasoner attributed the shortfall to a low original cost estimate and the rapid appreciation of labor and materials through the 1920s. And he now called for pure gifts to supplement the existing investments, so charity once again becomes part of the equation. However, this money was not forthcoming. The financial difficulties of 1926 continued, yet around 1929, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon took over as architects after Don Barber died. They replaced Barber's generally traditional design with a streamlined vision marked by horizontal lines and prismatic windows above the facade entrance. After the stock market crash, Reasoner eventually had to relinquish his hopes of constructing the temple tower as planned. And eventually, between 1947 and 52, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon built a 3-story central worship space between the apartment wings, a far cry from the planned tower, with its hotel, cross, and searchlight. And the irony is here is pretty clear that what were supposed to be the shortest parts of the building have ended up towering over the worship space itself. A New Yorker article of 1935 titled "The Fiasco of the Church Hotel" describes New York skyscraper churches as, quote, "curious structures that are bankrupt reminders of the folly of believing in economic miracles. Without the aid of a miracle, it could not be done, as the pastor discovered when the promoter surrendered his long-term lease and turned the whole project over to the church, together with a mortgage of $1.5 million or more, plus unpaid interest and taxes," end quote. The Depression also dramatically reduced the amount of church advertising, and by the late 1930s, even Reasoner questioned its efficacy. The alliance with business that had seemed so appealing during the boom years of the 1920s left many congregations reeling during the Depression. Religious studies scholar Colleen McDaniel argues that business and religion have been intertwined since at least the political founding of the United States, and that paying attention to this relationship allows us to understand, quote, "the subtle ways that people create and maintain spiritual ideals through the exchange of goods and the construction of spaces," end quote. So what can the skyscraper churches of the 1920s tell us about how religion relates to business and how this relationship is expressed architecturally and urbanistically? Skyscraper churches were primarily a phenomenon of the 1920s. This was a time when, according to Frederick Lewis Allen, quote, "business itself was regarded with a new veneration. Now people thought they praised a clergyman highly when they called him a good businessman," end quote. A favorite phrase of President and devout Congregationalist Calvin Coolidge, who he last encountered saying that advertising could save the world, was that the man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. Even if the relationship between business and religion was certainly not new, as McDaniel and others argue, it gained visibility and attractive power in the 1920s. Skyscraper churches were an unabashed sign of this relationship. Rather than hide the profitable aspects of religion, they emphasized religious profit and made it legible within the city. They even used this relationship to draw Americans to their churches and away from the supposed materialism of cities. Yet there's a contradiction at the heart of skyscraper churches. They simultaneously leveraged urban real estate to financially support themselves and used conservative arguments to reject the very cities whose growth they were benefiting from. But this paradox appears not to have bothered the pastors, trustees, and architects who made skyscraper churches. On the contrary, they saw skyscraper churches as a means of imposing an established but endangered religious and moral order in cities. Like other kinds of church advertising, skyscraper churches used the most modern techniques to argue for a traditional or, changing, but traditional sacred institution. Neon signs and crosses, brochures, and ultimately the skyscraper church itself explicitly used advertising techniques to sell the church to potential worshipers. As today's real estate prices skyrocket, urban religious organizations have again begun to construct and move into new spaces, including skyscrapers. From the Fifth Church of Christ Scientist in San Francisco to First Presbyterian Church in Miami to Beth Hamadrash Haggadol Synagogue in Manhattan, churches and other religious organizations are trying to build or move into tall buildings. In general, the religious visibility of the 1920s skyscraper church is missing in these churches, or these buildings. Instead, organizations often attempt to efface their religious character in the architecture of their buildings. This strategy may allow religious organizations to better participate in the real estate market, and I've argued elsewhere that it makes them less threatening to other capital partners. Instead of prominent crosses to light the cities, these organizations disappear behind the glassy facades of corporate real estate. However, this does not necessarily decrease their religiosity, but rather sublimates religion into a subtle alliance with capital. Although they may not announce their presence in the same way as their 1920s counterparts, skyscraper churches may well be the wave of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And thank you, both Harald and Alexander, for keeping perfect track of time. You're making my work way too easy today. We move on to our next speaker, and I was really thinking about how well aligned and complementary really the three presentations are with Raphaela Pavlokos' essay on remapping Canada's history, poetry as a tool to overcome trauma and colonization in Dionne Brand and Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's poetic works. Hi, please take it away, Raphaela.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. So to begin, I'd like to first say that I am a settler scholar. And I'm currently in Toronto, Ontario. So I'd like to start with a little bit of a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to first affirm the traditional and historical land rights of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Huron-Wendat, and they are the stewards of the land that I currently occupy, which is sometimes called the Greater Toronto Area. So how do we begin to talk about the unspeakable trauma of colonization? How can healing take place if we don't have a language that's able to adequately articulate the past, especially in the context of Black and Indigenous slavery, displacement, marginalization, and cultural genocide in Canada? Two Canadian writers, Dionne Brand, who identifies as a Black woman, and Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, who is Michi-Sage Anishinaabe, she's Anishinaabe, grapple with these questions in their work. Their solution? Poetry. Both Brand and Simpson use poetry as a tool to overcome the inadequacies of language and to facilitate connection, healing, and replacing Black and Indigenous bodies in Canada's geography and history. Today, I'm going to look at two poetic texts, Brand's Thirsty, which was published in 2002, and Simpson's Islands of Decolonial Love, which was published in 2013, as tools to bridge and transcend language. They're both writing their way to closure, to healing, and to connection. To do this work, I'm going to be using a methodology that I developed as part of my dissertation work, and it's called critical dispositioning. So I'm concerned with looking for ethical close reading strategies to use as a settler scholar to engage with minority literature. So I'm always asking myself these kinds of questions like, how as a settler reader can I unpack, inform, and supplement Black and Indigenous texts through ethical reading strategies? Critical dispositioning is a methodological praxis that I've designed specifically for settlers to engage with Indigenous texts ethically. So hinging on the multifaceted nature of disposition and all the different kind of meanings that can come from that word, the concept demands that settlers interrogate their own positionality before engaging with Indigenous texts, so as to not bring Indigenous texts into their settler epistemological frameworks, so that we don't apply our own internalized biases, and so that we don't read Indigenous texts through Western or Eurocentric generic frameworks. This work is important because as a settler scholar, finding ethical ways to read Indigenous or BIPOC poetry is necessary to keep the work situated in their own cultural context, while not appropriating or absolving the work of its contextual framework. Using critical dispositioning allows me to trace the use of BIPOC and Indigenous poetry as a tool to transcend language, remap land, and replace bodies in Canada's landscape that were previously elided. This work aims to dismantle colonial displacement by building community and creating temporary sites of healing, both through and within poetic works. In order to enact critical dispositioning, we have to develop a separate analytical space for analysis that's not inherently colonial, but also not inherently minority-based. This third space can facilitate convergent encounters while also still allowing for cultural, community, or geographical specificity. So you can see my very rudimentary Venn diagram here. This third space in the middle is where I imagine critical dispositioning to take place from. Ideally, this would be both a metaphorical and a physical space, but creating a totally neutral space for this mutual ethical engagement is virtually impossible. We can still attempt to do this work through poetry. So why is poetry a suitable tool to do this decolonial work? Poetry can rupture colonial space to open up new conversations. The Anishinaabe scholar Jill Doerfler thinks that creative production can challenge and question dominant narratives while allowing us to partake in an individual and collective experience that can lift the burden of colonialism by envisioning new realities. It's this artistic lens that can be used as a decolonizing process with the power to recall, envision, and create modes of resurgence, which Simpson actually uses in her own writing, taking advantage of this power through her short stories and her poetry. The famous Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye suggests that the Canadian poet cannot write in a distinctly Canadian language. Brand and Simpson take on the cultural and historical context of English and then work to dismantle it from within. They transcend the colonial implications of the English language as an inherently colonial language system imposed on Canada and its occupants through first contact. Poetry here acts as a tool for what Simpson calls the resurgence of Indigenous political, cultural, governmental, and nation building that's intimately connected with the homeland, language, and spirituality for Indigenous peoples. As Michel Lacombe notes, it is this task of decolonial artists, scholars, and activists to move beyond offering amendments or edits to the current world, but to actually display the mutual sacrifice and relationality needed to sabotage colonial systems of thought and power for the purpose of liberation. Both Brand and Simpson draw on poetry's power in genre and spirit as a tool to transform and to heal. They attempt to write against the past. In Canada, where for Black and Indigenous peoples, their histories have been elided, dispersed, or overwritten, this work is important and really hard to do due to the pervasiveness and deeply entrenched colonialism that's currently ongoing in every system and structure that's currently kind of at work in Canada. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's take a closer look at these two texts. We're going to start with Dionne Brand's Thirsty. Brand's long-form poem Thirsty participates in a rewriting of the murder of Albert Johnson and the public response to when police shot and killed him in Toronto at the door to his apartment in 1979. Johnson was a Black man, and the police officers that murdered him were white. This was a really big kind of case in Toronto at the time of police brutality. Brand fills in these gaps left out by Johnson's story by the media coverage of this event, using what Johanna Garvey calls a nonlinear path through both time and space, drifting through the moments and years both before and after the fall of Allen, who acts as a pseudonym for Albert Johnson in her text. Brand uses the physical space of the page to add another textual layer, incorporating blank pages interspersed throughout the text. I read these empty pages as creating space for the words and voices that Brand is using, adding breathing room into the lives she is replacing in Toronto's history. Brand is signaling to a reader how to approach her text and how to read it, engineering these pauses in the forms of blank pages within the narrative to control how the information is taken in by a reader encountering her text. Brand also engages with language and voice, signaling her distrust of language. Reading and writing in English or French in Canada is a forced participation in an ongoing colonization of land and Indigenous cultural production. Brand touches on this expression of history by looking at Toronto and its past. This language, while it might be mistaken as music, as Brand says in her text, is referred to as the sound before music when the throat vomits prehistoric birds by the narrator. I read this pre-music noise as poetry. Expression in its most basic, pure components of sound and vibration that convey beliefs and feelings before articulating recognizable notes or words. In the same vein as language, naming is also central to Thirsty. Brand rewrites Toronto's geography by participating in a remapping of the city. She's continually naming places, intersections, and even other suburbs that comprise the Greater Toronto area. This power of naming is used to claim space and show familiarity. Brand knows this city, belongs in it, and is able to use this knowledge to invert how we perceive or come to know Toronto. This remapping becomes a rupturing of space to express geography without words, using poetry as a tool to convey this. This replacing is beyond language in the sense that it can't be expressed through prosaic language, but rather has to be felt or experienced in another way, like imagery. This new Toronto is described through color, vegetation, smell, sounds, and other sensory imaginings. Catherine McKittrick proposes that our surroundings are speakable. There's a layering of perspectives and histories, a kind of palimpsestic production of Toronto's geography. We know that Brand is concerned with seeking to accent all the lost histories of this country as described by George Eliot Clark, particularly focusing on the individual Indigenous tribal experiences of colonialism. This project of geography becomes important, especially in relation to Indigenous writers, as their work deals with the everyday, ongoing, relational nature of indigeneity and decenters colonial frames of knowledge that Sarah DeLu highlights. Brand repositions Toronto in a new context for the characters in her text, but also for a reader, to force them into a space for critical dispositioning. Here we're called to slow down, reposition ourselves in relation to this difficult area in the text, and then navigate ourselves through it with this new understanding that we've now received. So shifting over to Simpson's text, there's multiple layers of voice, perspective, and interpretation using both English and Nishnabeg words, drawing from her Michi-Sagig Nishnabeg context. Simpson creates this double voicing in her text that ruptures genre and textual space. In both her poetry and her theory, Nishnabeg words are naturalized in the text. She doesn't other them with italics or invasive, like bracketed translations. And Simpson says that this is really intentional. It's a conscious choice. In an interview that she actually did with Dionne Brand, she says that she's not writing for white audiences, and she doesn't like to include a glossary so that everyone can understand the Nishnabeg words. In Islands of Decolonial Love, the body is integrally positioned as this producer and proponent of language when the narrator talks about hiding in poetics, singing in hieroglyphics, moving around their flesh in semiotics, but never reaching out. This is signaled in Simpson's use of the Nishnabeg word abab, meaning a key to open with something, unlock, release, loosen. This key to rupturing is Simpson's poetic form, which she uses to unlock and release Indigenous culture, language, and history from colonial influence and place it in its own context and space. Simpson has a different perspective on naming of people and places that simultaneously aligns and also kind of diverges from Brand's acts of renaming in Thirsty. Through landscape, Simpson renames geography with original Indigenous names, signaling to the reader that the English names are a conscious choice made through colonial cartography. These spaces have always been Indigenous. These place names have been whitewashed, but the residue of their indigeneity remains so deeply that, quote, when Toronto dreams, it dreams in Mohawk. Even when it names itself, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, all of these are Mohawk words. You speak Mohawk whenever you name this place as your home, end quote. Simpson's replacing of Indigenous names overwrites the whitewashing of Indigenous place names. She also does this later on when she renames what's colonially called Rice Lake with its traditional name, Pimadashkodayang. Poetry can be used as liberation. Poetry itself is grounded in language, but also emotion and feeling. Through devices like imagery, metaphor, the structure of rhyme, and the freedom to manipulate textual space, poetry transforms into a dialect, if not a new language altogether, that is more equipped to articulate, transcend, and transgress in ways that the rigidity of English rejects. Poetry's capacity to act as a force of healing is based in its grounding in connection and interconnection. Edward Glison's Poetics of Relation positions poetry as its own language, where poetry sanctions the moment when language ceases to take for its subject the recounting of the recounting of its connection with particular surroundings, to concentrate solely upon its fervor, to exceed its limits, and reveal through the elements composing it. This power to transcend space, time, language, and experience is all possible through poetic rupture. Overall, the poetic text becomes a kind of pseudo-space, its own separate sphere for critical dispositioning to occur, that kind of interrogation and repositioning oneself in relation to the theory, memories, experiences, and power dynamics that has the possibility to change the way people see, think, and experience the world around them. Poetry functions as both a bridge to connect community and language, and also as a tool that's separate from language, that can transcend its own construction in order to attempt a new form of telling unspeakable trauma, history, and stories. Through this remapping, Brand and Simpson are both attempting this community healing project that's only facilitated through their poetic form. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Raphaela.